Sometimes the love that feels like a lifeline is the same love that quietly tightens a noose around your heart. I remember meeting Michael one crisp autumn evening under the soft glow of string lights in my friend's backyard. He was everything a girl in her 20s might dream of, tall with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, and a voice that made you believe every word he said. When he leaned in and whispered, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," my chest tightened in a way I mistook for excitement. It was my first red flag. Looking back, I can see those early red flags as bright warning signs, but at the time they felt like fireflies dancing just out of reach. Tiny flickers of doubt that I chose to ignore. I was convinced that his attention, his charm was special, because it was for me. But within a few weeks of dating, I noticed he would frequently cancel plans at the last minute, citing vague emergencies that I never really understood. Then he would reappear with grand apologies, flowers, and promises that he'd make it up to me. I called it passion, but there was nothing passionate about repeatedly putting me second. At home, my best friend Amy cautioned me. "He's hot and cold," she warned gently over coffee. "When he's hot, you feel like the center of the universe. When he's cold, you feel like you're nothing." I nodded along, comforted by her concern, but I dismissed it. I was in love, wasn't I? Love meant accepting someone's flaws, right? The reality is, love doesn't ask you to settle for disrespect. Love doesn't leave you standing outside in the cold, waiting for a text that never comes. Early in our relationship, I started to feel a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Before every date, I'd wonder, will he flake again? Will he show up? Each time he did show up, lavishly apologetic. Saying, "I can't believe how lucky I am to have you," my worries would melt just for a moment until the next disappearance. By the third month, I had logged too many missed birthdays, forgotten anniversaries, and cancelled weekend getaways. I began to notice that he was the best version of himself when he was trying to get something, my time, my affection, or my assurance that I wasn't looking elsewhere. After we slept together for the first time, he became unreachable for days, his phone going straight to voicemail. I spent those nights crying on my apartment floor, willing him to send a single word. And then when he finally called, it was back to the "I've never loved anyone more" routine. Each apology was a bandage over a wound that never truly healed. This push-pull pattern, psychologists call it intermittent reinforcement, was Tiffany's story too, another friend who confided in me over lunch one Saturday. Tiffany described it perfectly. He gives you a taste of sunshine, just enough to promise summer, then pulls the clouds back in. We all crave consistency, the steady warmth of a partner who shows up. But when someone withholds affection and then doles it out like a reward for good behavior, it creates a cycle that's almost impossible to break. Your brain begins to chase those fleeting, happy moments, hoping they'll become the norm. One night I found myself sitting in my car outside his place at midnight, tears blurring my vision. He finally appeared at the door, casual and unhurried, as though I wasn't pacing in the rain for 2 hours. He looked at me and frowned, confusion creasing his forehead. "What's wrong?" he asked. In that moment, I realized how much I had normalized being disrespected. I'd accepted excuses, downplayed my own hurt, and excused behavior that I would never tolerate from a coworker or a friend. That's when I started doing small experiments. Whenever he cancelled or was late, I made a conscious choice I wouldn't apologize for being upset. I'd send one text, "I'm disappointed. Let me know when you're free." Then I'd close my phone and go do something else. I watched his patterns. Sometimes he'd rush to explain. Other times he'd vanish completely. But what I learned by stepping back was that my worth wasn't determined by his attention. I wish someone had taught me to spot these red flags earlier. The most common ones, as I now share with the women I mentor, include inconsistent communication, hot and cold texting or calls leaving you anxious between contacts, excessive charm, when kindness feels over the top, like an act designed to win you over rather than genuine interest, boundary pushing, making you feel guilty for wanting your own space or insisting on crossing lines you've clearly drawn, deflection of responsibility, blaming others, circumstances or your reactions instead of owning mistakes. Isolation from support, subtle jabs at your friends or family, or monopolizing your time so you drift away from your community. Recognizing these signs is the first step, but acting on them can be even harder. We're taught that love conquers all that sacrifice and compromise are sacred. Yet there's a difference between compromise, two people finding middle ground, and sacrificing your own emotional safety for a relationship that never truly values you. When Michael and I finally sat down to talk about the pattern I expected him to understand, instead, he looked puzzled. "I thought you loved surprises," he said, casting a sheepish smile. And in that moment, I saw clearly that his apologies weren't genuine. They were rehearsed. He cared more about the illusion of control than about my feelings. I realized I had two choices: continue chasing unpredictable affection, or step away and reclaim my own sense of self-worth. I chose the latter. It wasn't easy. Breakups never are. But letting go of someone who repeatedly made me feel small was the most loving thing I've ever done for myself. I remember sitting with Amy afterward, wrapped in a blanket on her couch. She handed me a cup of tea and said, "You did the right thing. You stood up for yourself." Until that moment, I had never truly rooted for me. Today, I coach women on recognizing these early warning signs. I share my story so that the next woman might hold on to her worth before the pattern becomes a prison. It's not about expecting perfection, but about demanding respect. When you see those flickers of doubt red flags, they're worth paying attention to. They're your heart's way of saying, "Look closer. Protect yourself. Remember you deserve someone who shows up not just when it's convenient, but because you matter every day." That kind of love is steady, it doesn't waver, and it never makes you question your own value. The moment I realized I was facing something far more dangerous than a broken heart was late one evening in my second trimester, when I woke up with a pounding headache, so fierce it felt like my skull was splitting in two. My belly was swollen, my ankles so tight I could barely slip off my shoes, and every muscle in my body ached as if I'd spent the day hauling bricks. I stumbled into the bathroom and stared into the mirror, my reflection pale and terrified. I'd been ignoring the warning signs for weeks. Small things, numbness in my fingertips, floaters drifting across my vision, sudden bursts of dizziness. But I chalked them up to normal pregnancy stuff. After all, my doctor had assured me at the last prenatal visit that everything looked fine. But the moment I saw those symptoms for what they really were, textbook indicators of preeclampsia, I felt my world tilt. By the time I called 911, I was barely conscious. Paramedics whisked me away with lights flashing. And I remember glimpsing my husband Rick pacing the hallway in sweatpants, his cell phone glued to his ear. He looked stricken, but I could tell he was more worried about the inconvenience this would cause him than about my life. That disregard, that shrug of his broad shoulders, was another kind of betrayal, one that threatened my very survival and that of our unborn child. At the hospital, a whirlwind began. Nurses took my blood pressure and gasped. The number on the machine read 180/120. A resident doctor explained in clinical terms, "You have severe preeclampsia. We need to induce labor immediately." I was 27 weeks along. I felt my heart slam against my ribcage. "What about the baby?" I croaked. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. "Early delivery carries risks, underdeveloped lungs, feeding difficulties, potential long-term issues. But with these readings, both of you are in serious danger." Hours later, I woke up in an ICU bed, a feverish haze of IV lines and beeping machines. My husband hovered at the foot of the bed, looking ashen. He mumbled, "I'm so sorry." But then his face hardened when a social worker entered with a clipboard and a calm voice. "Mrs. James." She said, "I need to ask about domestic violence or any injuries, any falls or hits to your abdomen." I was too weak to lift my arms, but I felt a spark of indignation. Domestic violence. Me yet the bruises on my arms from his playful shoves, and the one time he yanked my hair in anger, flashed through my mind. I'd dismissed those incidents as quirks of his temper. Now, framed as evidence, they looked like clues in a case file. The social worker's tone was gentle but firm. "We're required by law to ask. If you're in danger, we can help you get a protective order and secure legal assistance." I swallowed hard. I don't want to get him in trouble," I whispered, realizing how conditioned I had become to shield his ego over my own safety. That night in the dim hospital room, I lay awake reading the pamphlet the social worker had given me on the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. One line stood out. "You have the right to be safe. You have the right to legal protection." It was a mantra I repeated like a prayer, clinging to each word. When I was well enough to move to the postpartum unit, I asked the nurse to help me call a domestic violence hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE. A volunteer named Carla answered on the other end, her voice warm. "You're not alone," she said. "We can guide you through filing for an emergency protective order, connect you with legal aid, and help you find safe housing if needed." As she spoke, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen, as if those words alone offered a lifeline out of the suffocating guilt. The next morning, Rick came to visit. He brought flowers, a card, with a sappy poem about new beginnings. I let him in because I knew his silence would have been worse. Once I was settled in my wheelchair, I looked him in the eyes. I spoke with a social worker, I said softly. He flushed. They asked about abuse. I continued. He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. "Rick, I'm filing for a protective order." The words felt like acid on his skin. "You can't be serious," he snarled. "We're married." But this wasn't about paperwork. It was about survival. I let his fury wash over me, and then I called the court clerk myself, following the guidance the hotline had provided. Within 24 hours, an emergency protective order was in place. Rick was barred from the hospital floor and from coming within 500 feet of me or our home. In the days that followed, I leaned on a network of support I never knew existed. The state-funded legal aid office assigned me a pro bono attorney, a woman named Marisol, who helped me navigate the maze of family court. We filled out forms listing my injuries, the medical records from my preeclampsia, even a photo of the bruise on my arm. She explained the difference between a temporary protective order and a permanent one, and we filed for the highest level of protection available. Meanwhile, I was still processing the shock of his betrayal. Not just the violence, but the emotional abandonment that had begun in the earliest days of our relationship. My baby girl Harper was born premature, but she was a fighter, breathing on her own within hours, and I knew I'd done the right thing. Nursing her every feed, I felt immense pride in our tiny daughter and a stronger sense of self-worth than I ever had before. One afternoon, while she napped, I sat in the hospital corridor, chatting with another mother, Emily, who'd been through something similar. She lived in a small town in Texas, and the local shelter there had been her lifeline. "I got a protective order down there," she said, her voice steady with confidence. "And the shelter staff helped me connect to a great attorney. My ex got charged with assault. I'd never thought I'd have the courage to testify against him. But when I saw he was a danger to my son..." everything changed. Emily's story reinforced a lesson: seeking legal protection wasn't an act of betrayal, it was an act of self-preservation. As the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act funds have expanded, more shelters across America now offer legal clinics, counseling, and referrals. The transition from shame to empowerment happens when a woman understands that the law exists to protect her, not to punish love. Back at home, our old apartment felt like a cage. I moved into a friend's spare room for safety with Harper in my arms. Marisol's guidance helped me file for a longer-term restraining order, and I began weekly check-ins with a domestic violence advocate at my local YWCA. She taught me to document every call, every interaction, every harassing voicemail Rick left after the protective order was served. I also learned that preeclampsia rates in the United States affect roughly 2 to 8% of pregnancies, according to CDC data. Yet when it's tied to domestic violence, those percentages can spike dramatically. Many hospitals now screen for intimate partner violence during prenatal visits, but it takes courage to speak up. If I could send one message to any woman reading this, your silence won't keep you safe. Your voice might save your life. A few months later in family court, I sat on a hard wooden chair as Rick's lawyer tried to paint me as overly dramatic and vindictive. I felt a flicker of fear, but when I heard the judge deny Rick's request to lift the order, I felt a surge of relief and justice. The judge's words, "This court finds sufficient evidence of risk," were a verdict not just for me, but for every woman who's ever been dismissed. Harper is now 2 years old, a bubbly toddler obsessed with dinosaurs and bubbles. We moved into a small house near my parents', and I volunteer weekly at a local pregnancy center, helping other mums fill out the paperwork that once felt so overwhelming. I share my story openly because I've learned that every form signed, every restraining order granted, every legal consultation accepted is a step toward reclaiming autonomy. Today I still feel the echoes of that betrayal, the knot in my stomach when I hear thunder, the sudden flash of anxiety when a door slams. Those are the scars that every survivor carries. But I also feel pride in my resilience, in the tiny life I saved, in the legal protections that stood between us and something much worse. If you find yourself in that dark place, wondering if you should call the police, file for a protective order, or reach out for legal aid, I'm here to say do it. Call 1-800-799-SAFE. Look up your state's domestic violence resources. Ask your OB/GYN or midwife about safe screening for intimate partner violence. You don't have to prove your pain or justify your fear. The law recognizes your right to be safe. In those first frantic hours in the ambulance, I never imagined I'd come out the other side stronger, with my daughter healthy and my spirit intact. But I did. And so can you. I still remember the first time I sat in Dr. Nguyen's office, the walls lined with calming nature photographs and the faint scent of lavender wafting in from a diffuser. I had just escaped the whirlwind of the hospital, the protective orders, and the legal battles. I carried with me 2 scars, the physical ones on my arm, and the invisible ones lodged deep in my psyche. My chest felt tight. My mind replayed every angry glance, every whispered threat. I knew I needed help, but I didn't know what that looked like. Dr. Nguyen greeted me with a warm smile. "Welcome. You've already taken the hardest step by coming here." She handed me a packet on cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. As she explained, CBT would help me identify negative thought patterns like "I'm unworthy" or "I deserved his anger," and replace them with healthier ones: "I have value, and no one has the right to harm me." It sounded clinical, almost mechanical. But as we talked, I realized that my own mind had become my greatest enemy, spinning worst-case scenarios and replaying memories like a broken record. In our first session, she asked me to keep a thought journal. Whenever you notice yourself slipping into self-blame, write it down. Then ask, is that thought based on fact or on fear? That week, every time I caught myself thinking I caused this, I scribbled furiously in a spiral notebook. After a few days, patterns emerged. I blamed myself when Rick missed our prenatal appointments. I blamed myself when I struggled to bond with baby Harper during my forced early delivery. I blamed myself for not seeing the red flags sooner. One afternoon, I decided to test one of Dr. Nguyen's exercises. I had a panic attack at the grocery store, overwhelmed by fluorescent lights and the sound of carts clattering. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Instead of fleeing, I found a quiet corner and pulled out my journal. I wrote, "My heart is racing. I feel trapped. I'm going to be sick." Then I asked, "Is this thought true right now?" My hands shook as I scribbled the answer. "No, I'm not in danger here. I'm safe." I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly and repeated, "I am breathing. I am breathing." Moments later, I felt my pulse ease. That small victory felt like scaling a mountain. After a month of weekly CBT sessions, Dr. Nguyen suggested we add EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing for the trauma deeper than thoughts. I'd heard about EMDR only in passing, the therapist waving their fingers back and forth as you recount traumatic memories. But as she guided me through the process, I felt the weight of that night with Rick lift ever so slightly. I described the moment he pressed on my belly, how I felt him laughing while I sobbed. As I followed her hand movements and held a small focus ball, something shifted, I cried. But the agony didn't overwhelm me. When it was over, the memory still existed, but it no longer held me hostage. Alongside one-on-one therapy, I found community in a local survivors support group at our YWCA. Every Thursday evening, a dozen women gathered in folding chairs arranged in a circle. Some were mothers, like me. Some were college students, still living at home. Some were elderly widows, speaking gently about abuse in their youth. We shared what CBT had taught us, how EMDR helped with nightmares, but also how simple gestures, like a friend, texting "I'm here" made all the difference. I met Claire there, a former nurse whose own marriage had turned violent when her husband lost his job. She told me about John's mom support group in Palo Alto, California, where survivors ran free weekly workshops. They helped me build confidence to drive again to date again. She said, eyes bright, even as she admitted it had taken her 18 months of therapy to truly let go of her fear. Hearing her story inspired me. It showed that recovery wasn't linear. It was a journey of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I also encountered pitfalls. There was a week when I felt so much better and skipped my session thinking I could manage on my own. That night, nightmares returned of Rick's face, twisted in rage, of Harper's tiny cry, echoing in an empty house. I realized that stopping therapy early was like cutting a healing bone before it solidified. I called Dr. Nguyen first thing the next morning, apologizing through tears. She simply said, "Recovery isn't a race. Let's keep going." My therapist warned me that self-blame and shame were common saboteurs. "You'll want to isolate when you feel weak," she said. "You'll think, I don't deserve support. That's exactly when you need it most." So I set up an accountability system. Every Friday, I'd text my friend Amy therapy done, and we'd chat for 10 minutes about what came up that week. If I hadn't done the work, I owed her a coffee. That small commitment kept me on track. By month 4, I began to feel a shift in my baseline mood. The jagged edges of my anxiety smoothed out. I still felt sadness, especially on anniversaries, but it no longer knocked me off my feet. Sometimes I'd even laugh at a memory, a testament that the trauma had receded from the center of my life. One day, Dr. Nguyen suggested I explore faith-based counseling as a complement. I'd always been spiritual, but hesitant to return to church after losing my trust. Yet I remembered Father Michael's kindness years ago, so I agreed. At the parish hall, I joined Mrs. Zulia's Thursday charity meeting. The sound of gentle prayers and the sight of neighbours packing food baskets reminded me that healing often blooms in shared purpose. During a quiet moment, Mrs. Zulia placed her hand on mine and said, "God brought you here to show his love to others." Her words felt like an affirmation that faith and therapy could walk hand in hand. About 6 months into my journey, I volunteered to co-lead a new CBT-informed workshop for survivors who had just left abusive relationships. Partnering with the domestic violence advocate from the clinic, we created a 6-week program combining psychoeducation, how thoughts shape feelings with group EMDR demos, and art therapy exercises, like painting your safe place. On graduation night, I watched 12 women stand up and share their resilience stories. One of them, a young mother named Rosa, said, "You saved me by sharing your struggles. I finally asked for help." Hearing that felt like paying forward the lifeline I received. I also learned to celebrate small milestones. The day my journal entries showed more "I'm safe" than "I'm useless." I treated myself to a new journal cover. When my nightmares stopped entirely for a month, I bought that little focus ball in a brighter color, symbolizing how far I'd come. Recognizing progress, no matter how small, became a ritual of self-compassion. By my first anniversary of leaving Rick, I felt strong enough to recount my story publicly. I gave a brief talk at the YWCA fundraising breakfast, sharing how CBT EMDR and both secular and faith-based support had woven together to restore my life. As I looked out at the audience, survivors, volunteers, church members, I realized that my trauma had become a bridge connecting me to others in need. Today, my toolkit for resilience includes a CBT thought journal I carry in my purse, a 5-minute breathing exercise on my phone for panic moments, a network of therapists and support groups I check in with monthly, a faith practice that grounds me a simple prayer each dawn, an accountability partner who reminds me I deserve care. I still have hard days. Sometimes the scent of lavender brings back hospital memories. Sometimes a headline about domestic violence triggers a knot in my throat. But now I have strategies. I open my journal. I do the EMDR-inspired eye movements, I text Amy, or I step into a quiet pew at church. Each choice is a declaration I matter. My safety matters. Healing is possible. If you're reading this and feeling that ache in your chest, know that professional help isn't a last resort, it's a lifeline. Whether it's CBT to challenge dark thoughts, EMDR to process the deepest wounds, or a faith-based community to cradle your spirit, you deserve every resource out there. Reach out, stay committed for at least 6 months, and find your own support circle. Because on the other side of this storm is not just survival, but the chance to rebuild your life on foundations stronger than before. When I first walked into the community center, I carried a mix of hope and fear, like a suitcase I couldn't set down. It was my 2nd month post-therapy, and though the nightmares had eased, my days still felt hollow, without purpose. I remembered sitting in Dr. Nguyen's office when she'd asked, "What matters to you beyond healing?" I'd shrugged, unsure. But a spark ignited the next Sunday when I volunteered to help with the after-school tutoring program for kids in the neighborhood. That first afternoon, I met 10-year-old Javier, whose eyes were guarded like he'd built stone walls around his heart. He shuffled in backpack, slung low, avoiding eye contact. "Hey, buddy," I said, gently spreading out his math worksheet. "Let's tackle these fractions together." He looked at me suspiciously then, as I explained how dividing a pizza into equal slices worked. He cracked a tentative smile. When he suddenly understood why Hanhantamth of Mutinsonsert was 118, his grin was victory itself. As the weeks passed, Javier became the only reason I looked forward to Wednesdays. Seeing his confidence bloom reminded me of the little life I'd fought to protect my daughter Harper, and it stirred something inside me. I didn't just want to recover, I wanted to give back. I began brainstorming what if I could create a safe space for these kids every single day, not just 2 afternoons a week. I pitched the idea to the centre's director, Mrs. Caldwell, a sharp woman with a heart of gold. "We don't have funding for full-time programs," she cautioned. But she didn't say no. Instead, she introduced me to a local church group that had a small grant for after-school activities. With that seed money, $3,000, I officially launched the Bright Horizons Tutoring Club. The first challenge was logistics. I rented a tiny room in the church basement, tables crowded so closely that tutors and students practically touched elbows. I recruited volunteers via flyers at the library, on neighborhood Facebook groups, and by showing up at local PTA meetings. Slowly, my army of volunteers grew retired teachers like Mrs. Ramirez, college students like Marcus, studying education, and fellow survivors like Claire, who found in the kids' laughter a balm for her own wounds. We began with 20 children. Each one had a story. Some lived with single parents working 2 jobs. Others had special needs that mainstream classes couldn't address, and a few were refugees still grappling with English as a second language. Every afternoon, I opened the basement door and greeted them. "Welcome back to Bright Horizons." We offered math help first, then reading circles, then arts and crafts. Snacks came courtesy of a local cafe that donated day-old muffins. Slowly, the program became a lifeline for families. But turning volunteer energy into a sustainable operation revealed a common pitfall: burnout. I recall one evening after a 12-hour day that included my own job and 2 rounds of tutoring. I collapsed on my couch with my head in my hands. My phone buzzed with messages, reminders of tomorrow's lesson plans, emails from worried parents, and a note from Marcus asking for more advanced algebra worksheets. I felt overwhelmed, like I was drowning in good intentions. That night, I fished out the self-care plan Dr. Nguyen had helped me draft. It included 3 items: 30 minutes of quiet reading, a 10-minute mindfulness breathing exercise, and at least 1 evening off per week without program responsibilities. I admitted to myself that I'd been operating at full throttle with no breaks, so I texted Claire, "I need a day off." "Can you cover Wednesday?" she replied instantly. "Of course, you rest." I realized that building a community meant trusting others to step in when I needed to step back. With that buffer in place, Bright Horizons thrived. By the end of the first year, we served 80 children across 3 sites, thanks to a partnership with the public library and a small grant from a regional education foundation. I learned to write grant proposals, track budgets, and keep attendance records, all skills I never imagined I'd master. I also discovered the power of storytelling. Each quarter, I compiled a simple newsletter with photos of smiling faces and brief testimonials. I used to hate reading. "Now I read to my little brother every night," wrote Aisha, age 9. As the program grew, I met other survivor-turned-leaders whose stories inspired me. Cheryl from Denver, who founded a non-profit protecting at-risk youth after escaping her own abusive childhood, and Maria from Portland, who created an online support network for mothers recovering from postpartum PTSD. Cheryl's organization, Shelter Hearts, had started as a kitchen table discussion among friends and had blossomed into a multi-city initiative with paid staff. Maria's Mothers Together website offered virtual peer counseling, drawing over 1,000 members within months of launch. From Cheryl, I learned the importance of a long-term vision. "When we first started," she said over coffee at a non-profit conference, "we camped out in homeless shelters offering workshops on self-defense and resume writing. Our mission expanded as we listened to the needs of the community." Always ask, are we meeting real needs or just chasing funding? That advice echoed in my mind as I drafted our 3-year strategic plan. Expand to 5 sites. Add a family engagement program on Saturday mornings and launch a summer STEM camp. From Maria, I learned the value of technology. She'd built her platform on open source tools and managed a volunteer driven webinar schedule. Don't let tech scare you, she told me. A simple Facebook Live chat can reach more people than a 50-page brochure. I experimented by hosting monthly virtual homework help sessions via Zoom. Parents who couldn't bring their kids in person logged on from 2-parent work schedules, shared their challenges, and got strategies in real time. The chat box buzzed with gratitude. "Thank you for helping me help my son," wrote one father. But I also faced pitfalls. Early reports showed low attendance in virtual sessions due to unreliable internet access among low-income families. I realized that technology alone wasn't enough. We needed a hybrid model, so I partnered with a telecom advocacy group to secure discounted broadband for qualifying families and donated refurbished tablets through a reuse electronics program. Slowly, attendance climbed. Through these ups and downs, I discovered 3 essential lessons for turning purpose into impact. Build a team, not a solo act. Recruit volunteers with diverse skills, teaching tech fundraising and delegate responsibilities. Establish clear roles. Program coordinator, volunteer manager, grant, writer, community liaison. Balance ambition with sustainability. Set realistic goals tied to resources. A 5-year expansion makes sense only if staffing and funding follow. Monitor metrics, monthly attendance. Academic improvements like grade increases, parent satisfaction rates. Guard your well-being as you guard others. Maintain a self-care practice. I still meditate each morning, journal twice a week, and take 1 weekend retreat annually. Use a simple project management tool to schedule work hours and personal time, preventing spillover. After 2 years, Bright Horizons received national recognition as a model community tutoring program, and I was invited to speak at an educational nonprofit summit in Chicago. Stepping onto that stage, I remembered the tearful nights alone in my apartment, wondering if I'd ever feel worthy again. Now I stood before hundreds of educators and advocates, sharing how I transformed heartbreak into hope for dozens of children. On the plane home, I opened my notebook and wrote a prompt I'd share with the audience. Think about one skill or passion you have, whether it's baking, coding, or storytelling. How could that bring purpose to someone else's life? I smiled, thinking about the simple power of giving, the way it stitches our own wounds into the fabric of community care. Back in our quiet home, Harper chasing bubbles in the backyard, our cat curled at my feet. I reflected on how far we'd come. After everything, purpose felt like more than a resume entry. It was a beacon guiding me each morning. When the inevitable hard days arrive, the budget cuts, the late-night emails, the ache for rest undercut by guilt. I remember Javier's smile, Cheryl's determination, Maria's ingenuity. Those connections remind me that transforming pain into strength isn't just possible, it's contagious. If you're wondering how to channel your own experiences into meaningful work, start small. Look around your community. Is there a neighbor who needs homework help? A shelter in need of mentorship programs? A local library hungry for citation workshops? Begin with one child, one project, one conversation. Gather a few friends. Keep an eye on your well-being so that serving others doesn't cost you your own recovery. Because in every act of giving, whether it's explaining fractions to a doubtful 10-year-old or writing a grant proposal at midnight, you're not only helping others grow, you're reaffirming your own worth. And in that reaffirmation lies the true power of purpose-driven healing. The summer sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon. The Willamette glowed like molten gold as I sat on my porch, rocking gently in the old chair John had gifted me years ago. Even after all this time, I still felt the river's steady pulse at my feet, a reminder that life moves on, carving new channels around every obstacle. That evening, I had a visitor, Gabriella Marlene's granddaughter. She'd flown in from New York to spend a week with me, eager to see the city where her grandmother and father had once lived. When she arrived, I led her down to the riverbank. We walked in companionable silence until she picked up a smooth pebble and tossed it into the water. "Why do you keep coming back here?" she asked, her voice soft against the gentle rush of the current. I thought for a moment. "This river carried me through my darkest days," I said. "It taught me that no matter how strong the rapids, the water always finds a way forward. I come here when I need to remember my own resilience." Gabriella nodded her gaze, following the ripples. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a faded photograph of Gabriel as a boy, his bright eyes peering at the camera. She handed it to me with trembling fingers. "He would have turned 60 this year," she said. "I wanted you to have this." I held the photo as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," I whispered, tears gathering. In that moment, the river's song felt like a benediction. The past could be both mourned and honored, but it need not define our every tomorrow. Over the next few days, Gabriella and I explored Portland's hidden corners: the Rose Garden in Washington Park, the old brick bookstore downtown, the Sunday farmers market by the waterfront. With each outing, I told her stories: how I first met Frank at a square dance, how Father Michael's homily cracked open my hardened heart, how Claire's workshop showed me that sharing pain could lighten its weight. In return, Gabriella shared her own memories of her father, the way he'd hum lullabies in his Brooklyn apartment, the model airplanes he built with her as a child. Through our storytelling, our family's fractured history began to knit itself into something gentler, more whole. One afternoon, she asked, "Did you ever think your story would reach so many people?" I smiled, thinking of the virtual circles I led each month for survivors across the country. I used to believe my pain was a weight I carried alone. But the day I spoke publicly, that first YWCA breakfast talk, I realized my story was a lantern guiding others through their dark nights. That night we sat on the porch swing as fireflies blinked in the gathering dusk. I shared with her the final piece of my resilience toolkit, one I'd come to cherish above all. Each month I host a small gathering at St. Sebastian's Parish Hall, open to anyone who's experienced loss or trauma: grandparents, teenagers, neighbors. I encourage them to bring a photo or an object that symbolizes their own story. We share in a circle, listening without judgment, acknowledging that our wounds often echo across generations. Last month, a young man brought his grandmother's quilt, stitched from scraps of her childhood dresses. As she spoke of surviving war and raising her family, I saw tears in every eye. We learn that healing isn't just individual, it's communal. On the anniversary of Harper's birth and loss, I light a candle by the riverbank and write her name in the sand. Then I place a small flower on the water's surface. It's a way to honor her brief life, without letting grief become a prison. Years ago, Gabriella joined me for that ritual. She brought wild daisies from her Brooklyn neighborhood and whispered a wish for her grandfather. We watched the petals drift downstream, a shared act of love and release. After my book was published, I began mentoring other survivors who wanted to document their stories. We meet online every other week, editing chapters, brainstorming titles, encouraging one another past imposter syndrome. One mentee, a woman named Sophia from Miami, turned her chapter into a local theater piece performed by high school students. Last I heard, her play had moved audiences to tears and to action. In memory of Harper and all children lost too soon, I helped organize a small 5K along the waterfront. Families walk, jog, or push strollers wearing ribbons in teal and gold. Proceeds support neonatal research and domestic violence shelters. Last year, Over 200 people showed up. Survivors, supporters. My former students from Bright Horizons, holding balloons for every child they'd helped. Every Sunday, I returned to St. Sebastian's, not out of obligation, but because grounding myself in ritual prayers, hymns, the sign of peace, nurtures a hope that transcends the individual. Father Michael, now retired, but still a mentor, greets me with a gentle smile. Your strength reminds me of the river's current, he tells me. Never underestimate the power of small, steady acts of faith. On our final night together, Gabriella and I stood on the porch, the river whispering below. She slipped her hand into mine. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said. My life feels more rooted now. I squeezed her hand. Your presence here has rooted me too. Healing isn't a one-way street. It flows both ways through time. When she left the next morning, I watched her drive away with her suitcase full of mementos, my old journals, photographs of our tutoring club, a jar of wildflowers, pressed between the pages of my latest book. I felt a hollow ache, yes, but also a glimmer of gratitude. Our family's story was no longer just a tale of pain and betrayal. It had expanded to include redemption, courage, and the possibility of new beginnings. That afternoon, I walked down to the riverbank alone. The current was steady, the water clear near the shore. I knelt and dipped my fingers in the cool flow, closed my eyes, and whispered a thanks to Harper, to Gabriel, to Gabriella, to every soul who had walked this path with me. Then I let the current carry away my whispered prayers, knowing they would mingle with every tide, every rainstorm, every sunrise. As I stood wiping damp palms on my skirt, I realized that peace isn't a destination, it's a living, breathing practice. It's choosing gratitude alongside grief, hope alongside remembrance. It's passing on what we've learned, so that the next generation can stand a little taller, walk a little straighter sail, a little further down life's winding river. Back on my porch, I picked up my notebook and wrote today's reflection. Peace is not the absence of storms, but the wisdom to navigate them with compassion. Tomorrow I'll lead another healing circle, and the next day I'll join our small book group, and every Sunday I'll find myself in that familiar pew. In all these moments, I'll carry the memory of Gabby's pebbles rippling across the water, and I'll remember that my story, like the river, continues moving forward, inviting others to float alongside.